Mm. Hi, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. Our topic for tonight is neoliberalism and the Supreme Court. I should be being joined in a few minutes by Dee Pierce, the host of Around the World with Dee and Friends. And in fact, here is Dee right now. Hi,
Good to be
Dee.
here. Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Well, thank you. I'm happy you are here. Okay, so we are, I think, all ready to go. What we're going to do tonight is we're going to look at the influence of neoliberalism on the Supreme Court. And even though it was not necessarily the case that things would work out, okay, in this way, when you combined the institution of the Supreme Court, its potential power, with the neoliberal philosophy and its dominance here in America since the 1980s, you were bound to get a horrible mix that would produce all the kinds of injustice.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start by taking a look at some neoliberal attitudes. Uh, those attitudes are embodied in part, okay, in a piece from Common Dreams that makes clear what Senator Ron Johnson wants to do. He's a particularly obnoxious example, okay, of a neoliberal. Let's look at a piece that deals with some of his ideas. Uh, I should be sharing that now, MID?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thanks. So there's Ron Johnson. He somehow made it back into the Senate in his last run in 2022. Anyway, the title of this article is Senator Ron Johnson argues against rich paying fair share to ensure Social Security's survival. Of course, it's one of the tenets, okay, of neoliberalism that there should be as little taxation as possible, especially for the rich, because of course, according to the neoliberals, they are the job creators. So, the Wisconsin Republican millionaire accused working class Americans of, quote, getting a lot more in return, unquote, from the key social program, specifically Social Security, than rich people who paid disproportionately less into its coffers. This article is by Brett Wilkins. It was done on July 12th, just yesterday. So, but U.S. Senator Ron Johnson came under fire Wednesday after the multimillionaire Wisconsin Republican, here he is, greedy multimillionaire, asserted during a Senate hearing that Social Security, an economic lifeline for tens of millions of Americans who paid into the system throughout their working lives, unfairly takes from wealthier people to support lower income retirees. I have to admit to full disclosure here. Okay, I am a recipient of Social Security, and there's no question that without Social Security, I wouldn't be able to live today. And when I say I wouldn't be able to live, I mean that without Social Security, I wouldn't be alive today. So of course I am not exactly a disinterested person when I talk about Ron Johnson, okay, and the neoliberalism that he embodies. Going on with the article.
I just want to add something is the fact that when paying into Social Security, there is a limit with people's money, how much they make. So they have a certain amount of income you make. Is it, what is it, like 300,000 or something, or 250,000 or something, or even 200,000? I think, I don't know, a certain amount you make, and they don't do Social Security over that amount out of your pay.
It's far less than that. I think I haven't looked at the limit lately, but I believe it's now 130,000. They stopped deducting Social Security, FICA contributions after the first 130,000, okay, of income.
Right. So
So
he's taking home a hell of a lot more.
the really rich people who earn, let's say, 50 million a year or 60 million a year or something like that, uh, they run through their required Social Security payments in something like 2 hours. Okay, and for the rest of the year, they don't have any Social Security deductions. It's this kind of really ridiculous thing, okay, that goes on. And then there's somebody like a Ron Johnson who complains about it.
Right. So it's not really affecting them at all, the Social Security tax.
Yes, but they still want to take it away from the rest of us.
It's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous complaint that they're making.
It's a ridiculous complaint. Speaking during the Senate Budget Committee hearing entitled Protecting Social Security for All, Making the Wealthy Pay Their Fair Share, Johnson said that his Wisconsin constituents, quote, have a basic misconception about Social Security, unquote. Johnson, one of the wealthiest U.S. senators, according to the watchdog Open Secrets, derided Social Security, a key New Deal program, as a, quote, nanny state, unquote, scheme, which is enacted because the government doesn't trust Americans to save for retirement on their own. Of course, I have to object to that. Uh, Social Security, okay, is there because some people believe in the right to a decent and dignified retirement. And if Ron Johnson thinks that's an anti-state scheme, what I would say, he is just somebody who is not civilized enough to understand that people are entitled to, that is, have a right to, a decent and dignified retirement after contributing to the economy for their whole working lives. 40 or 45 years, okay, or whatever it is they work before they get to retire. Uh, okay. A civilized country believes that people have a right to have a retirement which is decent and socially inclusive. By the way, Social Security is not even as decent as that. For many people, the pension is horribly low, and they
Mm-hmm.
cannot make it on that pension. They need other resources and other subsidizations. Sometimes they have that from parts of the federal government, but very often they're being subsidized by their family members. In other words, as here are these people complaining about Social Security, and it's not even a decent and socially inclusive pension, nowhere near what they provide, okay, in European states, on the order of half of what is provided in Europe, in what everybody likes to call the richest country on earth, the richest country on earth, can't afford. Well, of course, it's not that we can't afford it. It's because we got guys like Ron Johnson, who are in the Senate, who don't think that people over 65, I guess the age now is 67, who don't think that people over 67 have a right to a decent life after that age. What can we say about such people? They're brutes. They don't belong in a civilized state. We should take them all away and put them on an island of their own and let them fight it out with each other, bare knuckles. Quote, this is quoting again from Ron Johnson, quote, most people think, quote, well, that's my money. And in fact, part of it is, unquote. The senator continued, quote, if you're in a low income group, you're getting a lot more in return than you invested in. If you're in the high income, you're not getting what you paid in. So it's not a private insurance scheme. It's not a private insurance scheme. It's not an insurance scheme at all, actually. Social Security payments are payments that exist to allow people to have a decent life after retirement, because Franklin Delano Roosevelt and those who passed Social Security during the 1930s and 1940s, they believed that people had a right to a dignified and socially inclusive retirement. And the majority of us today believe in that particular right. And we don't believe that the United States ought to be a jungle after 65. Now, maybe Ron Johnson thinks that's what ought to happen, but most of the rest of us do not think that. I have no idea how Ron Johnson, was reelected in Wisconsin in 2022. I haven't studied that particular race, but maybe I will. I think it was a reasonably close race, but somehow Ron Johnson won it. It was probably because of the influence of money in the campaign. Anyway, Social Security works, an interest group which works to protect and expand the Social Security program, tweeted, Senator Ron Johnson uses the hashtag Social Security Fair Share hearing to oppose making the wealthy pay their fair share. He also tells lies about the Social Security Trust Fund's $2.9 trillion surplus. Johnson seems to think that trust fund isn't real, but that's our money. Well, I hate to inform Social Security works, and I know they know that. You're not being straight, in what they say. The Social Security Trust Fund is nothing but an accounting record. It is not money. It is an accounting record of what the federal government owes to Social Security recipients. It's an obligation of the federal government to pay it out. That's true. But it isn't money that is sitting in a trust fund account somewhere. And people have to understand that. They have to understand that if they want to get their Social Security, they have to continue to fight for it. They have to stop people such as Ron Johnson, from doing things like, for example, stretching the payments out over time by lowering the payments, of course, that would cut the amount of Social Security that would go to each person, okay, in the program. So there might be $2.9 trillion there, and that might be enough to ensure full Social Security payments until 2033. But what the Peterson Foundation would like to do, and what Ron Johnson would like to do, is to start to cut Social Security payments right now so that it would take a longer period of time to run out of the $2.9 trillion. Okay, in other words, instead of just appropriating the money to people each year with a fresh appropriation and seeing that that is a living appropriation, a socially inclusive appropriation, they would rather pretend that the trust fund amount of $2.9 trillion is somehow a fixed amount that can never be changed by Congress. That is a lie. It can be changed by Congress, Kate, any time. Congress could raise the accounting record to $5 trillion tomorrow if it wanted to, or to $10 trillion. So don't listen to people say that there's only $2.9 trillion there. So Lisa S. at Cassidy Ray 1414 said GOP wants to save Social Security by raising the age to 69. Yeah, that's a favorite thing. Don't pay anything out to people until they're 69. Then that 2.9 trillion is going to last, okay, a longer time. That's one way of cutting Social Security. Dems have a better plan, Social Security Expansion Act. Well, it's not too high a bar to say that it's better than what the Republicans want to do. But expanding Social Security benefits by $2,400 a year and fully funding it for 75 years by applying payroll tax. Well, first of all, it's not fully funding it for 75 years. This is all just accounting records and projections, okay, and things like that. If you want to fully fund it for more than 75 years, if you want to fully fund it forever, then include some language that says that Congress has to pre-fund Social Security the year before the Social Security payments are due. If you put in some language like that, then Social Security would be considered to be fully funded forever, okay, indefinitely. I know that sounds funny, but that's the way the funding works in the federal environment. Uh, anyway, going further with the tweet, expand Social Security benefits by $2,400 a year, fully funds for 75 years by applying payroll tax to incomes over 250,000. Okay, again, I hate to tell everybody this, but the payroll tax is not funding Social Security payments. When the payroll tax is made, okay, to the federal government, it's actually a FICA contribution. But when the contribution is made to the federal government, the bank settlement that is made when the Treasury Department deposits those taxes actually destroys the taxes in the process of settlement. No corresponding increase is made to the Social Security Trust Fund. As I said before, it's just an accounting record. Okay, it's not a bank account. So if you raised the payroll tax to incomes over 250,000, yes, you increase the accounting record of what the federal government owes to Social Security recipients. but you don't actually increase the money that is there to pay the Social Security recipients. Where does that money come from? It comes from the appropriations that Congress makes uh, uh, each year. Those appropriations are mandated for payment by the Treasury Department that must make those payments into the economy, into the private economy, to the people who are due to receive those payments. Okay, patient advocate and cancer survivor Peter Marley tweeted on Wednesday that, quote, Senator Ron Johnson is a liar. And it was clear from today's hearing that he's the defender of the rich and not for the people, unquote. Okay. I couldn't agree more. Senator Ron Johnson is a liar. But he wasn't a liar when he implied that there was no money in the Social Security Trust Fund. Johnson previously called Social Security a Ponzi scheme in one of many attacks on the program upon which 66 million Americans rely. Well, he was lying about that because it is not a Ponzi scheme from a technical definition point of view. In Ponzi schemes, the people who are running the Ponzi scheme have no way of making the payments good when it's time to pay out the money from the Ponzi scheme. But with Social Security, the government always has the means to pay out Social Security. All Congress has to do is to appropriate the funds.
Mm-hmm.
And then the mechanism exists for the Treasury Department to make those payments. But this, okay, is not a stream that goes into the mechanics of how the federal government makes its payments. But the point here is if the Treasury Department is mandated to make those payments by congressional appropriations, it will make those payments. It will never default. It has ways of never defaulting on making those payments. What those ways are would have to be covered in another live stream. So, it's not a Ponzi scheme. Further arguing during Wednesday's hearing, Social Security was not meant to be a general welfare system. Johnson turned to Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy Executive Director Amy Hanauer. I want to make clear here, Johnson is a millionaire. Okay, in Amy Hanauer's case, she's the wife of Nick Hanauer, and together they are billionaires. So they are richer than Ron Johnson. Okay. Okay, so in this case, the billionaire, who's the executive director of the Institute on Taxation, okay, and Economic Policy, which is a nonprofit, is testifying that, quote, our tax system raises far too little from those with the most, unquote, to ask what he called, quote, a very simple question. So, one point to make about this is that Amy Hanauer, who's a billionaire, is for the tax system taking far more from she and her husband than they do now. Why? Because she's a patriotic American. Ron Johnson is just a swine. Quote, out of every $1 of income that any American makes, he queried, how much should the maximum amount the government takes out in total? I think it depends upon the income. In other words, if someone has a low income, okay, per year, then the federal government should not take anything out. On the other hand, okay, if the government is a Ron Johnson, then the government should take a higher percentage out. That's the principle of the progressive income tax system. I know Ron Johnson is questioning whether we should have such a system. But we have that kind of system, and we have it for good reason, because to most people it makes a lot of sense. To Ron Johnson, it doesn't make a lot of sense because Ron Johnson's a greedy SOB. Quote, I think we should think about the kind of country we want to have. Hanover began to reply before Johnson interrupted her to demand an answer as a percent. Quote, you know, she asserted, we had 400 billionaires who paid less than an 8% tax rate. So more than that. It strikes me that in a society where the wealthiest are getting more and more of our income, they can afford to chip in more to maintain the systems that enable them to build that wealth in the first place. Unquote. Tweet from her foundation, ITEP. As at Amy Hanauer notes in this morning's Senate budget hearing, the poorest 20% of Americans pay 8.4% of their income towards taxes for Social Security and Medicare combined in 2022, while the richest 1% pay just 2.3% of their income.
Mm-hmm.
So Ron Johnson, that swine, is complaining because he had to pay 2.3% of his income out. Oh, does everybody feel really sorry for him? Senate Budget Committee Chair Sheldon Whitehouse followed Hanauer's response by opining that it would make a very big difference to me in how much should be taxed on a dollar of income, whether it was the first dollar of income of an individual or their billionth dollar of income. Yes, me too. I think if it's their billionth dollar of income, they should lose 99% of it. On Tuesday, the Social Security Administration's Office of the Chief Actuary published an analysis showing how Democrats, the Medicare and Social Security Fair Share Act, could extend the social program solvency for generations by increasing taxes on incomes over $400,000. There was another bill introduced earlier this year by Senators Bernie Sanders, Independent of Vermont, Elizabeth Warren, Democrat, Massachusetts, and Representatives Jan Schakowsky, Democrat of Illinois, and Val Hoyle, Democrat of Oregon, would boost monthly Social Security benefits by at least $200. Well, I'd love to have that $200, but you got to admit, it's really pretty cheap. Pretty cheap. That $200 a month, that's the $2,400 a year expansion they were talking about. Try $10,000. That would go a lot further to making it a living pension or a socially inclusive pension. $2,400, okay, is nothing. Okay, it represents how far the Democratic Party has fallen, okay, as a party that tries to protect the poor people of this country. Meanwhile, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy has announced the creation of a fiscal commission tasked with finding ways to reduce the national debt. Warning last month that he was going to make some people uncomfortable by looking at cuts to Social Security and Medicare. Yeah, all this is baloney. He's just replaying what the Peterson Foundation is constantly saying. The size of the national debt, I'm here to tell you, has nothing to do with fiscal sustainability. If the national debt were $1 or the national debt were $50 trillion, this would not cut into the ability of the federal government to spend more money one whit. There is no difference between a zero national debt and a $50 trillion national debt in terms of the fiscal sustainability of the federal government. Now, Kevin McCarthy is going to tell you something different. He's going to say, the debt we have now is fiscally unsustainable. It's all going to be all have to be paid by our grandchildren. I'm here to tell you, it doesn't have to be paid by our grandchildren. But if they want to pay it, they can vote to have it paid through the federal government simply minting a platinum coin with a face value that covers the whole national debt, put that in a special treasury account, and use it to pay off the national debt as it falls due. Not all at once, that would be inflationary, but as it falls due. So that's the first article I wanted to call your attention to emphasize the greed of the neoliberals and the lies of the neoliberals and the dishonesty of the neoliberals and their hostility to regular people. I wanted to emphasize that. Then I wanted to look at a second piece. This piece was also from Common Dreams, which of course you know by now is my favorite outlet. But that particular piece, just to show something in contrast to poor Ron Johnson and his suffering because he had to pay 2.3% of his income, most probably. Corporate windfall profits, this is the headline, surged to $1 trillion a year as working people suffer. Big business is gaslighting us all. They're hiking prices to make monster profits, plundering people under the cover of a polycrisis, unquote. This piece is by Jake Johnson. It was written on July 6th. An analysis released Thursday shows that 722 of the world's top corporations made combined windfall profits of $1 trillion per year in 2021 and 2022 as people across the planet struggle to meet basic needs due to the price hikes that businesses have used to pad their bottom line. He might have added during the pandemic emergency. The humanitarian groups Oxfam and ActionAid found that the companies raked in 1.09 trillion in windfall profits, defined as profits significantly above a given corporation's average in 2021 and $1.1 trillion last year. That's in 2022, of course. That's an 89% increase in total profits compared to the average between 2017 and 2020, according to Oxfam and ActionAid's analysis of Forbes' Global 2000 ranking of the world's largest companies. A major windfall during the period in which extreme poverty and global hunger surged. Of course, that kind of result strengthens the oligarchy in all the countries that have an oligarchy, which is most countries in the world at this point. The windfall profits of leading food and beverage companies, for example, in 2021 would be enough to cover the $6.4 billion funding gap needed to deliver life-saving food assistance in East Africa more than twice over. By the way, Big Pharma and major retailers also cashed in on the cost of living crisis that has seen more than 250 million people in 58 countries hit by the acute food insecurity of 2022. Big Pharma, by the way, 45 energy corporations made on average $237 billion a year in windfall profits in 2021 and in 2022. sure the figure will come up here in a second about what Pharma made, but here we go anyway. People sick and
Please.
tired of corporate greed. Amitabh Behar, Oxfam's interim executive director, said in a statement, quote, "It's obscene that corporations have raked in billions of dollars in extraordinary windfall profits while people everywhere are struggling to afford enough food or basics such as medicine and heating," unquote. Big business is gaslighting us all. They're hiking prices to make monster profits, plundering people under the cover of a poly crisis, unquote, Behar added. Even the IMF recently conceded that corporate profiteering has been a major contributor to price increases that have fueled cost of living crisis worldwide. Oxfam and ActionAid said such a tax would generate, that is a wealth tax, okay, a windfall profits tax, like 50 to 90% windfall tax on the profits, would generate hundreds of billions of dollars a year in revenue that could be used to lift people out of poverty, reduce hunger, slash energy bills, and support global South nations on the front lines of the climate crisis. There are some other quotes here. I don't think that I have to go through them. You're getting the point. The neoliberals have been cashing in while they work politically in each country to try to prevent poor and middle class country from getting any significant share of their windfall profits. Now, these two pieces were by way of introduction to a really terrific piece that is by Michael Hudson. Okay, Michael Hudson, who we've seen before in these streams, on July 7th, 2023, in Counterpunch, wrote a piece. Should there be a Supreme Court? Its role has always been anti democratic. A vested interest creates checks and balances, primarily to make political systems non responsive to demands for social reform. In other words, the Supreme Court is there right now to protect the neoliberal system and the people who benefit from it. Going on. Vested interests create checks and balances primarily to make political systems non responsive to demands for social reform. Historically, therefore, the checks are politically unbalanced in practice. Instead of producing a happy medium, their effect often has been to check the power of the people to assert their interests at the expense of the more powerful. Real reform requires a revolution, often repeated attempts. The Roman Republic suffered 5 centuries of fighting to redistribute land and cancel debts, all of which failed as the oligarchy's checks imposed deepening economic dependency and imbalance. The Supreme Court is America's most distinctive check, uh, says Michael Hudson. Its deepening bias, since its takeover by, quote, conservatives, unquote, claiming to be, quote, the originalists, unquote, interpreters of the Constitution, has led to the most widespread protests since Franklin Roosevelt threatened to pack the court in the 1930s by expanding its membership to create a more democratic majority. Although appointed by presidents and consented to by Congress, the judge's lifetime tenure imposes the ideology of past elections on the present. So why are they needed at all? Says Michael. Why not permit Congress to make laws that reflect the needs of the time. The court's judges themselves have pointed out that if Congress doesn't like their rulings, it should pass its own laws or even a constitutional amendment to provide a new point, of reference. Michael says that is not a practical solution in today's world. The most obvious reason is that Congress is locked in stalemate, unable to take a firm, progressive step because of how far the U.S. political as well as judicial system has long been dominated by corporate and financial interests. In other words, the situation we address in our Dump the Corruption programs on Wednesday and Friday. Wielding enormous sums of money to corrupt the election process since the Citizens United ruling in 2010, even at the nomination stage, to determine the candidates. Yes, even at the nomination stage, like we saw these huge contributions come into the primaries to defeat the kinds of candidates who would have been about redistributing income, trying to meet the problems of inequality, trying to do something about the climate emergency, trying to pass a Medicare for All bill. Going on with the article, the Federalist Society has embarked on a 5-decade lobbying effort to groom and promote judges to serve the vested interests. When today's Supreme Court act as mediums to ask what the original drafters of the Constitution wanted or meant, they simply are using these ghostly spirits as proxies for today's ruling elites, the neoliberal ruling elites. Long before the U.S. Supreme Court's, the originalist, quote unquote, seances, he refers to them as having seances at the Supreme Court, rejecting his unconstitutional laws that most Americans want on the excuse they're not what the wealthy New England merchants and Southern slave owners who drafted the Constitution would have intended. Classical Greek and Roman oligarchies created their own judicial checks against the prospect of Sparta's kings, Athenian popular assemblies, and Roman consuls enacting laws at the expense of the vested interests. Sparta had 2 kings instead of just one, requiring their joint agreement on any new rules. And just in case they might join together to limit the wealth of the oligarchs, they were made subject to the Council of Ephors to advise them, quote unquote. A kindred Roman spirit called for 2 consuls to head to the Senate to ward against their joining together to cancel debts or redistribute the land. The constant demand of Romans throughout the Republic's 5 centuries, from 509 to 27 BC. The Senate's meetings could be suspended if religious authorities found omens of the flight of birds or other airy phenomena. These always seemed to occur when a challenge to the oligarchy seemed likely to pass. I think this is even worse than what we have here now, isn't it? The historian Theodore Mommsen called this tactic, quote, political astrology, unquote. The most blatant attempt occurred in 59 BC when Julius Caesar was elected consul and proposed an agrarian law to settle some of Pompey's veterans, as well as urban plebes, on public land in Italy. Also, additional land was to be bought from private owners using funds from Pompey's campaign in Asia Minor. But Cato the Younger led the Roman Senate's optimates who feared Caesar's or anyone's popularity, opposing any change in the status quo. He started one of his famous all-day speeches Caesar ordered him led away, but many senators followed Cato out, preventing a vote from being taken. Caesar then simply bypassed the Senate to put the measure before the Centuriate Assembly that was composed largely of army veterans. That was a tactic that the reformer Tiberius Gracchus had perfected after 133 to promote his own land redistribution. That's 133 BC, I believe, for which he was assassinated. The oligarchy's traditional fallback defense in all epochs. When Caesar's opponents threatened violence to block the popular vote, Pompey threatened to use his own force. And when the time came for the Senate to ratify the law, Caesar and Pompey filled the forum with their soldiers, and a large crowd gathered. Cato's son-in-law, M. Calpurnius Bibulus, was Caesar's annoying co-consul and tried to suspend the voting by claiming to see bad omens, making public business illegal. Caesar, though, overruled Bibulus based on his own higher authority as Pontifex Maximus, leading Bibulus to declare the rest of the year a sacred period in which no assemblies could be held or votes taken. But the crowd drove him away and broke his insignia of consulship, the ceremonial fasces. Okay, by the way, of course, you know the fasces were the traditional but strands of wood that were bound together to make the bundle strong, which became the symbol for the fascists of the 20th century, carried by his lictors and beat the tribunes allied with him. Cato likewise was pushed away when he tried to force his way to the platform to block the vote. He and Bibulus then fled, and Caesar's bill was passed, including a clause requiring all senators to take an oath to adhere to it. So Bibulus went home and sulked, insisting the entire year's laws be nullified because they were passed under threat of violence. It was the oligarchy, however, that settled matters by assassinating Caesar and other advocates of land and debt reform. So Michael, who obviously is an expert in ancient history, Athens, which turned oligarchic in the 4th century BC, he now starts to talk about Athens, after losing the Peloponnesian War with Sparta, used a tactic closer to today's Supreme Court by trying to subject laws to conformity with an alleged, quote, ancestral constitution. That presumably should never be touched, at least in a way that would favor democracy. Claiming to restore the supposed constitution of Solon, the 30 tyrants installed by the oligarchy of Sparta in 404 BC downgraded the Athenian bulls governing 500 citizens into a merely advisory group whose views had no official weight. The great watershed in Athenian history had been Solon's seistachia, literally shedding of debt burdens, in 594 BC, canceling personal debts that bound debtors in near bondage, near slavery. New demands for debt cancellation and land redistribution remain the primary democratic demands for the next 4 centuries. Androcian, circa 344 BC, a follower of the oligarchic Isocrates, sought to claim the authority of Solon while denying he had actually canceled debts, claiming that he merely revalued the coinage, weights, and measures to make the debts more easily payable. But there was no coinage in Solon's time. So this attempt to rewrite history was anachronistic. That often happens when mediums claim to channel the spirit of the dead who cannot speak. In a similar tradition, the authors of America's Constitution created the Supreme Court to provide a check on the danger that essentially political evolution might lead Congress to pass laws threatening oligarchic rule. There is
Oh,
no longer a pontifex to block the democratic lawmaking by claiming to read auspices in the flight of birds or other airy phenomena. Instead, there is a more secular subordination of new laws to the principle that they must not be changed from what was intended by the authors of the Constitution as interpreted by their counterpart elites in today's world. This approach fails to take into account how the world is evolving and how the legal system needs to be modernized to cope with such change. I had found it to be an axiom of history of legal philosophy that if the popular political spirit is for democratic reform, especially supporting taxes and other laws to prevent the polarization of wealth between the vested interests and the economy at large, the line of resistance to such progress is to insist on blocking any change from original constitutional principles that supported the power of vested interests in the first place. The U.S. political system has become distorted by the power given to the Supreme Court, enabling it to block reforms that the majority of Americans are reported to support. The problem is not only the Supreme Court, to be sure. Most voters oppose wars, support public health care for all, and higher taxes on the wealthy. But Congress itself, captured by the oligarch donor class, routinely raises military spending, privatizes health care in the hands of predatory monopolies, and cuts taxes for the financial rent seeking class while pretending that spending money on government social programs would force taxes to rise for the wage earners. The effect of the corporate capture of Congress, as well as the Supreme Court, is the ultimate oligarchic backstop is to block congressional politics as a vehicle to update laws, taxes, and public regulation in keeping with what voters recognize to be modern needs. The Supreme Court imposes the straitjacket of what America's 18th century slave owners and other property owners are supposed to have wanted at the time they wrote the Constitution. James Madison and his fellow Federalists were explicit about their aim. They wanted to block what they feared was the threat of democracy by populists, abolitionists, and other reformers threatening to check their property, quote, rights, unquote, as if these were natural and inherent. The subsequent 19th century's flowering of classical political economists explaining the logic for checking rentier oligarchies was far beyond what they wanted. Yet today's Supreme Court references still, quote, what would the authors of the U.S. Constitution, slave owners fearful of democracy, have intended, unquote. That logic is applied anachronistically to limit every democratic modernization from the right of unionized labor to go on strike to abortion rights for women, cancellation of student debt, and the right of government to tax the wealthy. Even if Congress were not too divided and stalemated to write laws redirecting what most voters want, the Supreme Court would reject them, just as it sought for many decades to clear a national income tax unconstitutional under the theory of takings, quote unquote. The Supreme Court can be expected to block any law threatening the victory of the Thatcherite and Reaganomics doctrine of privatization, small government unable to challenge the power of wealth, but big enough to crush any attempts by labor, women, or minorities to promote their own interests. A state of affairs that is an anomaly for a nation claiming to be a democracy. Folks, what was the victory of Thatcherite and Reagan economics? That victory was the victory of the neoliberals. It was their notions of small government, their notions of dominance of wealth, their notions of supposedly free markets, but in fact that were to be run by oligarchies. That is what the Supreme Court has now decided, that it is not going to change, but in fact is going to decide cases in such a way so as to enhance the domination of Thatcherite and Reaganomics, their globalization, their privatization attempts, their blocking, of any legislation that would attempt to equalize things for poor people, or for middle class people. Their dedication to the destruction of the middle class. Michael goes on, a nation's constitution should have the flexibility to modernize laws, taxes, and the regulatory power of government to remove barriers to broadly based progress, living standards, and productivity. But these barriers have been supported by oligarchies throughout the ages. That was why the Supreme Court was created in the first place. The aim was to leave the economy in the control of property holders and the wealthiest families. That anachronistic judicial philosophy is helping turn the United States into a failed state by empowering a wealthy minority to reduce the rest of the population to economic dependency. I would say to penury. We are repeating the economic polarization of ancient Greece and Rome that I've described in my recent book, The Collapse of Antiquity. The 7th and 6th century BC crisis of personal debt and land concentration led to social revolution by reformers. Quote, tyrants, unquote, was not originally a term of invective. In Corinth, Sparta, and other Greek-speaking city-states, and the Aegean Islands, Solon was appointed archon to resolve the crisis in Athens. Unlike reformers in other Greek cities, he did not redistribute the land, but he did cancel the debt and remove the land's crop payment stones. The ensuing 6th century saw Solon's successors lay the groundwork for Athenian democracy. But the next 3 centuries saw the rise of creditor oligarchies throughout Greece and Italy, using debt as a lever to monopolize land and reduce citizens to bondage. These increasingly aggressive oligarchies fought with more and more overt violence against new reformers seeking to cancel debts and redistribute the land to prevent the economy falling into austerity, clientage, and reliance on the dole. Their oligarchic ideology was much like that of today's right-wing Supreme Court in its approach to constitutional law. The common denominator is an age-old drive to prevent democratic change. which of course is exactly what neoliberalism is about. Above all, by using wealth as a means of controlling the political process. The donor class here in America right now and how they control us. That is the philosophy outlined in the Powell Memo and in the Supreme Court Citizens United ruling permitting the political campaign system to be financialized and, in effect, privatized in the hands of the donor class. As in classical antiquity, the exponential rise in debt has polarized wealth ownership. Personal debt bondage no longer exists, but most home buyers and wage earners are obliged to take on a working lifetime debt burden to obtain a home of their own, an education to get a job to qualify for mortgage loans to buy their home, and credit card debt simply to make ends meet. The result is debt deflation, as labor is obliged to spend an increasing proportion of its income on debt service instead of goods and services. That slows the economy, while creditors use their rising accumulation of wealth to finance the inflation of housing prices, along with stock and bond prices, with yet more debt financing. The conflict between creditors and debtors is a red thread running throughout American history, from the Whiskey Rebellion of the 1790s to the monetary deflation of the 1880s, as hard money creditor interest rolled back prices and incomes to be paid in gold, increasing the control of bondholders over labor. Today, U.S. debt and tax policy is passing out of the Congress to the Supreme Court, whose members are groomed and vetted to make sure that they will favor financial and other rentier wealth by leading the court to impose the founders' pre-democratic philosophy of constitutional law, despite the past few centuries of political reforms that, at least in a nominal sense, have endorsed democracy over oligarchy. The victory of rentier wealth has led to the deindustrialization of America and the resulting predatory diplomacy as its economy seeks to extract from foreign countries the products that are no longer producing at home. This is why foreign countries are moving to pursue a philosophy rejecting debt deflation, privatization, and the shift of economic planning from elective governments to financial centers, from Wall Street to the City of London, the Paris Bourse, and Japan. Any resilient society's constitution should be responsive to the evolution of economic, technological, environmental, and geopolitical dynamics. U.S. legal philosophy reflects mainstream economics in trying to lock in a set of principles written by creditors and other rentiers fearful of making the financial system, tax system, and redistribution of wealth more conducive to prosperity than to austerity and economic polarization. Well, there no longer is an attempt to roll back the clock to impose the outright slavery that most framers of the Constitution endorsed. The spread of debt deflation and debt dependency has become a form of economic bondage that is the modern conservative counterpart to the racial slavery of old, is what the original power elite are thought to have wanted if we choose to go back in a time machine and ask them, instead of looking towards a less oligarchic but future. So that, of course, is a very brilliant piece. But Michael raises unanswered the question, should there be a Supreme Court? He doesn't really answer that question. He tantalizes, makes us wonder, should we abolish the Supreme Court? Okay, I'm going to try to answer that question. The current Constitution but gives authority to the Congress, which allows the Congress to take back the lawmaking power from the Supreme Court. There is no necessary reason to abolish the Supreme Court. What must be done instead is to use the very Constitution we've been talking about to limit the power of the Supreme Court in various ways. Of course, people are talking about expanding the Supreme Court so the justices are no longer neoliberals. Clarence Thomas, Sam Alito, John Roberts, Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, also Elena Kagan, all of them. Oh, I forgot also Gorsuch. Every last one of them is a neoliberal justice in their beliefs and their philosophies. Kagan, generally speaking, is quite pro-corporate. Sonia Sotomayor has not been noted for her departure from neoliberalism, but she may have some promise if the court itself changes. Ketanji Brown Jackson, the new justice, seems to be someone who is against the domination of American life by corporations, who is distinctly not a neoliberal in her concern for the poor. So we have at least 2 of the 9 justices who might change the court. However, how can the court be changed when the role of money is so great in getting the justices appointed? How can the court be changed when it has arrogated to itself the power of judicial review that over custom and over time has grown to such an extent that people think that the power of judicial review is greater than the power of any other offices to review and to evaluate and to interpret what the Constitution says? The answer to that question is these things can't be changed without a wholesale change, of the Congress. But they can be changed if people will use their power to vote out all the Congress people who are taking big money, large individual donations, also donations from PACs, also donations from party committees, donations from the very wealthy, also super PAC support, which candidates can repudiate, if they want to. If the voters insist on it, by voting against both candidates and office holders who are taking that kind, of big money, then the Congress could be changed. It could be changed for long enough to expand the Supreme Court. It could be changed for long enough to pass laws that use Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution to strip the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court away from new campaign finance laws. It could pass new laws repealing the decisions of the Supreme Court and strip the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court from reviewing those laws. The Congress can take away the power of judicial review from the Supreme Court. Not only Congress can do things like that, but presidents can take away the judicial review power of the Supreme Court. How? Just by saying they don't accept the law as read by the Supreme Court, just by insisting that they too are officers who have taken an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution against all enemies, domestic and foreign. They can even announce that they believe that the majority of the Supreme Court at this juncture of history are domestic enemies, and that the executive branch is justified in not obeying the decisions of the Supreme Court. As Andrew Jackson once said, the Supreme Court has made its decision. Now let them enforce it. The Supreme Court doesn't have the enforcement authority. So it doesn't have the sole authority when it comes to interpretation of law. Our Constitution provides checks and balances that the executive branch is not using, that the legislative branch is not using to overcome the neoliberal decisions the Supreme Court has been making. All the decisions of the Supreme Court in recent years, even before the total domination created by Trump, even before the Supreme Court was neoliberal enough that most of its decisions involving economic matters are pro-corporate. They've been pro-corporate since at least the Clinton administration. No decisions go the way that is favorable for the middle class, and for the poor. All the decisions seem to be in favor of the rich. How can we get around that? Jurisdiction stripping. That works. Defiance by the presidents of the United States. Refusal to recognize decisions by the Supreme Court. That works. Packing the Supreme Court. That also works. By the way, if there was considerable judicial stripping, stopping the Supreme Court from actually reviewing laws, and that became a habit. I don't mean that it happens all the time, but every Supreme Court has its particular areas where it's making decisions that go against the popular will. Sometimes those decisions are well grounded, and it's obvious that they modernize, that they help the country to adapt to change. Such was the decision of the Warren Court in outlining separate but equal schools. it was obvious that that was an anachronism that had to be changed. And the Warren Court actually changed it. If we're to have a democracy, it's obviously, it's an anachronism to allow gerrymandering to exist, to allow voter suppression to exist, okay, to allow a situation where you don't have a national election day where everybody is off work to go to the polls. That is an anachronism. Many anachronisms could be healed by the Congress using judicial stripping. We know the current areas in which the Supreme Court makes decisions that are favorable to neoliberalism, an ideology which is itself now, an anachronism. It's obvious that we've gone beyond our understanding of society that allows neoliberalism to continue to exist. So the legislatures ought to be able to adjust. The courts should be able to adjust. And the executive branch should be able to adjust. And under our Constitution, they can all adjust. But to create the capability for the adjustment, the people have to dump the corruption. So the Congress people who follow the donors are no longer there because they're being defeated for taking that very donor money. If we could use that kind of approach to get rid of a Congress like the Congress we have now, and to elect representatives and senators not beholden to these donors, we can get the kind of Congress, the kind of president that will stop this Supreme Court from preventing the modernization of America, that will prevent this Supreme Court from reinforcing the oligarchy, from reinforcing the neoliberal kind of ideology, which has governed us now for more than 4 decades, well into its 5th decade now. A proper Congress that rejects the donors could end that. A proper president that is elected by people who vote against candidates that are using big money from the donors, that kind of president would not be beholden to the donors and would be in a position to say to the Supreme Court, you have made your decisions. Now let's see you enforce them. For my part, I will proceed with my interpretation of the Constitution, which I think the majority of the American people support. So we will proceed with laws passed by the legislature and approved by the executive branch. And we will either strip your jurisdiction, or if we don't strip it, and you produce a decision which is way out of step with the population, we will just refuse to give the force of law to that particular decision. So my point is, we don't have to abolish the Supreme Court. The authority in the Constitution is already there to limit its power, okay, and to make sure it doesn't get out of step with the evolution of the country to new ideas, with the new needs that prop up. We have ways of making the Supreme Court become an institution which again helps the country to evolve rather than holding the country back. What we need to do is use those powers that exist in the Constitution and the power that exists in the people to turn away from the oligarchy, to turn away from the oligarchical class, and to turn towards real democracy, which is democracy from the bottom up. Not me, but us. That kind of democracy, that is the kind of democracy we must have. And we can have it without completely abolishing the Supreme Court, okay, by moderating its power while still retaining the ability of the Supreme Court to interpret the laws, not without challenge. But we can moderate the Supreme Court in such a way that its decisions again become valuable for the United States, again support the evolution of the United States, and no longer hold us all back and destroy democracy by reinforcing the oligarchies that have formed. So, Dee, any comments?
Let me think. It's just so much, this neoliberalism. It's just, you see so much that it's just for money and profit, and the rest of us, what's going to become of the rest of us?
What's going to become, okay, of the rest of us is we'll be reduced to poverty. We will all be reduced to poverty and total dependence on the wealthy classes.
Pictures of them throwing crumbs at us.
We have to reject that.
Yes, we do.
And the way to reject it is the way, okay, that I've outlined. Okay, there are some ideas that couldn't come close, okay, to what I've outlined. Like some people go forward and say, okay, don't vote for the duopoly parties. Don't vote for any of the candidates. But just vote for third parties. That can work. But you have to vote for the right third parties. Third parties that themselves are not subject to the donor oligarchy. I'm
That's
sure
the
the
key.
Green Party, okay, is one of those. But I'm not certain, okay, that the Libertarian Party is one of those.
Mm-hmm.
If the no labels people were to form a party, that party wouldn't be one of those. It will be full of members of the donor oligarchy because they're the ones who formed that effort in the first place. Okay, because they thought that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party were too democratic, too small d democratic. So they wanted a no labels party, which they've never been able to successfully implement. What I'm saying here is that The party is not the thing. Okay? The thing is whether the congressional candidates, whether they're incumbents or challengers, have been bought by the big money.
That's the key.
And the only way to make sure they haven't is to vote against anybody who is taking the big money. And now I recognize that it's possible for someone taking big money to not be bought by it. But friends, let's be real about this. If we're talking about a whole Congress, how many out of a whole Congress who were taking the big money aren't bought by the big money interests? How many do you think can resist being bought, can retain their independence, their psychological independence, their political independence? Being real, I don't think it can be more than a handful of people. And we cannot make exceptions for a handful of people, not if we're going to turn this around. We need everybody who enters Congress to be on board when they get into Congress. And if they do start accepting any big money when they're in there, we have to immediately vote them out and not let them continue to serve. That's what it will take to get the big money out of politics. So if you think we've lost our democracy because of the big money, the only way we can get it back is to make the big money poison to people running for office. You've got to make it toxic to them. Otherwise, things won't work. Kay says, I've never been so poor. Says, since I lost my home, I can no longer sell plants, or herbal vinegars. I'm sorry, Kay.
And it just really bothers me because this was all done with intent. They all went in there to change the economics in the country.
Yes, they did.
Wanting the money to go to the elite,
Yes,
the
they
people with the
did.
money.
That is what the Powell memo was about.
Mhm.
It was a plan for taking back the country by the economic elites. They thought they had lost control. They were unhappy with the EPA. They were unhappy with OSHA. They were unhappy that other forward-looking bills that Nixon got pressured into passing. That's why they went to Lewis Powell and asked him for a plan. And he delivered that plan, and they followed it. It wasn't the short-term plan. It wasn't going to work in 1 or 2 or 3 years, but it was a plan that would work over generations. And we find ourselves living in an oligarchy now because they followed that particular plan. If we follow a plan of driving the toxic money from politics, we could make change a lot faster. Okay, a lot faster. Within 3 congressional cycles, we could change everything. That's only 6 years. And we could start to change substantially in the first 2 years by replacing every representative in the House of Representatives.
And that has to get done. It has to be done.
It has to be done, and it has to be done because, as we've shown in previous programs, they're all taking the big money. Not one could pass the litmus test.
Nope. None of them. They're all taking big money. Every single one of them.
Every one of them.
And you wonder why you get the answers you get when we ask for Medicare for all, health care. You talk about the situation with Israel and Palestine and any place else in the world. It's you look at who they're taking money from.
And remember, the big money controls the corporate
Yes,
media.
yes, it does. And even we were talking tonight about the prison system,
Yes, we are.
and you see who controls it, the money,
The big money
private prison.
controls the prison system.
Yes.
And the court system, okay, is, the Supreme Court is making it impossible for people who are unjustly convicted to bring forth new evidence that will exonerate them. Okay, the Supreme Court has nearly made that impossible now. That's a total travesty, okay, of justice, and totally supports the neoliberal elites.
So it's
because
nothing about we the people. We the people are kicked to the curb.
because it puts an incredible burden on poor people, okay, and black people, who most often are the victims of these unjust
Mm-hmm.
prosecutions and convictions. So that's the truth of the matter. Okay, I don't see many comments. Okay, I see Kay's comments, of course, which I read earlier. Uh, I think we are here and Kay is here, and that's about
Yes.
it for tonight.
Boy, at night you'll have to put your show out again, rebroadcast it. Go into StreamYard and it has the video section and you can hit rebroadcast. And so you just put in a time when you want to rebroadcast it.
Okay,
I've been doing that with my show.
okay, that's a good idea. Uh, how successful have the rebroadcasts been?
They've been very successful because I'll rebroadcast it at either 11 or 12 o'clock at night because then you figure Europe's ahead of time and California behind time. And then sometimes I'll rebroadcast it in the morning or early afternoon. And it always gets views.
How many are you getting?
It depends on the show, but sometimes it could be usually about 5 or 6. But then again, each broadcast, well, some may have 2, some may have up to 6. And then, it's just different amounts, different times. And it's not much to do. You just go in there into the videos and then just put the time you want to do it, the day and time.
Okay, I'll try that. Okay, if I have it. In order to rebroadcast, do you have to have the recordings in StreamYard?
Well, StreamYard is where I do it. I
Right,
do
I
it in
understand
StreamYard.
you do it in StreamYard, but are you rebroadcasting the recordings in StreamYard?
Yes. I'm
Okay,
doing it
but
again in
have to
StreamYard.
do it in StreamYard. You can rebroadcast from YouTube also, can't you?
Well, when I do it in StreamYard, I'm rebroadcasting it to everywhere that I sent it to. So you
Oh,
can
to
rebroadcast it again
to
on
everywhere.
Facebook, Twitter, everywhere else. Yeah, I do it on LinkedIn. Every place I did it before, I do it again.
Okay, I may have to make a change. I'm not sure that my recordings are getting through right now because I think I have used too much storage capacity,
Oh, okay.
and I don't think they're picking up the new streams. So in my case, I would have to download them from YouTube. Okay, and then once I have to upload them to StreamYard, I don't know. I have to check that out. I have to see what I could do.
Yeah, because StreamYard, like I said, that rebroadcasting, I never saw it before. I don't know if it's new or if it has been around for a while, but I never noticed it before.
Yeah,
Um,
I noticed that it can be done because it was being done um, um, by Shane, actually.
oh, okay.
He would rebroadcast. Well, what he would do is he would download the stuff and then he would rebroadcast it.
Okay, I don't, like I said, I just go into StreamYard and it's, the videos, and then it has rebroadcast. I hit the rebroadcast and it just wants to know the day and time. Then it also has all the places that you broadcast to, and I hit them all for it to go to all the different places, and then I rebroadcast it again.
Yes.
Tonight's show is going to show again at 11 o'clock tonight. So,
Oh, I see. That's interesting. Okay, but when you create a new stream,
see, I'm not creating a new one now.
right. In other words, what you're using,
There's a video that's already there. Because you have
yeah,
a list of videos, and then it has, it's rebroadcasting, and I rebroadcast it.
okay, okay. I have to see if I can take a video from YouTube and download it and then load it into StreamYard. Uh, just run it as an original stream. I have to,
Okay.
I can do that because that's what I'll have to do, I think. The last of my videos that I have here was one from May 30th. Okay, for example. Okay, so I don't have any videos on here for
Mhm.
June, okay, or later, because that's when I ran out of space.
Okay, because I got rid of a bunch of stuff. About a couple of months ago, I got rid of a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, I know. I did that too back before that, though.
Oh, I know, because you're the one that told me about to do that.
Yeah.
So whatever. But anyway, I just rebroadcast it again because you figure there's people in California that 11 o'clock is 9 o'clock. Even when I did it at 12 o'clock, I had a lot of people, but it's the nighttime because of the time changes. And then the afternoon, like 2 o'clock, 3, 4, I mean, around, 5 o'clock, I mean, those times are good times too.
Oh, by the way, we're still live
Yes.
as we're discussing this. I didn't mean for this to be live,
Okay.
but
Well, anyway,
okay, I'm going to end the broadcast at this point.
okay. And just thank everybody for being here. Thank you, Kay.
Yes,
And
and please do remember uh, our Buy Me a Coffee accounts and also our Patreon accounts.
hit the like button, subscribe, and share. We appreciate that. And most of all, we're just happy to have people here watching the show and learning.
Yes, so thank you very much. Hope you learned a lot from this one. Uh, and if you did, I hope you'll be back tomorrow and we'll have a Dump the Corruption show.
Sounds great.
Okay, and Dee will have another, okay, Around the World with Dee and Friends show.
Yes, at 8 p.m. Eastern Time.
And I will be on with a Dump the Corruption show at 9.
Yeah, sounds great. We'll see you tomorrow at 8.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes, good night, everyone.
Bye.
You're welcome.